slip the surly bonds of earth and dance the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Hi, and welcome to the 11th installment of the Dad Project, the second of several I have planned about my dad's time in Vietnam. Glad to have you back, and tonight we will follow my dad, Pete Purvis, as he and the Coral Sea steam across the Pacific Ocean on their way to Yankee Station off the coast of North Vietnam as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. Here, he and his fellow airmen would bomb targets, protect those who were doing the bombing, take pictures of what they had done, all the while avoiding every variety of anti-aircraft weapon in the Soviet and Chinese arsenals being provided to the North Vietnamese. But first, let's get to know the mount my dad would be flying for his big adventure. As the gruesome ground war churned across Europe in World War I, the public chose to focus their imaginations on the one-on-one dogfights being fought above those killing fields. These pilots, these dogfighters, these knights of the sky would be celebrated on both sides of the war. Now, death in the sky was just as bloody and just as painful as any that happened in the trenches, but the public chose the fiction that these pilots were coming at each other like the knights of old, with honor, with skill, and respect for their foe. The respect for these knights of the sky was further elevated with the term ace. This term was first used by French newspapers to describe Adolf Pigout when he became the first pilot to shoot down 5 aircraft, German in his case. The aircraft these pilots flew soon became just as important as the men that flew them, and each major war since World War I has seen one aircraft come to define aerial conflict in the public's imagination. During World War I, the Sopwith Camel would come to the fore in the public's mind's eye. Although not a particularly easy plane to fly, and very unstable in most of its flight envelope, it would be used by Major Billy Barker to shoot down 46 aircraft and balloons from September 1917 to September 1918. Remarkably, of the 5,490 Sopwith Camels made, those 46 kills were all made in the same airframe, making that particular Sopwith Camel the most successful fighter in RAF history. And we can't go on without mentioning that the Sopwith Camel was the trusted steed of Snoopy in his efforts to help the Allies to victory, despite his lack of success with the Red Baron. Curse you, Red Baron. In 1940, a month before Dunkirk would shake the British public and military to its core, the British Purchasing Commission, based in the U.S., had placed firm orders for what would become the defining aircraft of World War II, the P-51 Mustang. The first Mustangs would find their way to Britain, while the initial American order would be for the A-36, a dive bomber derivative of the Mustang that would be called the Apache. These first Mustangs and Apaches would be powered by an Allison engine that, combined with the plane's fine aerodynamic form, gave these early Mustangs reasonable performance but nothing special. It would be Packard's license-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that would elevate the Mustang into a league of its own, when it was fitted into the B model and beyond. Its rate of climb, top speed, combined with excellent flight characteristics, made it a dominant dogfighting machine. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang had a range of over 1,600 miles, and they were able to escort 8th Air Force bombers to Berlin and back, and soon put the Luftwaffe on its heels. The definitive variant of the Mustang, the D with its bubble canopy, would be the most produced of the 15,000 units built during the war. Redesignated as the F-51D following the war, they would find their way into numerous reserve and National Guard squadrons, and then to be called up to fly in Korea in that dichotomous air war that found modern jets mixing it up with World War II era aircraft. However, it would be the F-86 Sabre that would be the aircraft that the public would fixate on during the Korean War. Like the P-51, the F-86 would be built by North American Aviation. In fact, the initial XF-86 design borrowed its straight wing from the P-51, which kept it in the air but couldn't approach the required 600-mile-an-hour top speed required by the USAF. Through the good offices of Operation Paperclip, North America's designers were able to take advantage of Germany's wartime aerodynamic research that found the swept wing would allow for high speeds and to avoid compressibility problems as the airplane approached the speed of sound. The Sabre's top speed was 687 miles per hour. Unfortunately, the Soviets also had access to Nazi German aerodynamic research, and the MiG-15 came as a huge surprise, and depending on the flight envelope and pilot, was superior to the F-86. Buzz Aldrin, Gus Grissom, and John Glenn, among others, would cut their teeth on the F-86 over Korea. Which brings us to the aircraft that is synonymous with the air war over Vietnam, the F-4 Phantom. Aircraft development following World War II can best be described as manic. The promise of the jet age was made with fingers crossed. Most types, whether they be bombers, fighters, or attack aircraft, were still being filled with prop-driven planes or an odd hybrid like the Ryan Fireball that had a jet and a propeller but could only manage a top speed of 406 miles per hour. When jet technology, reliability, and advanced aerodynamics needed to take advantage of jet power finally came together in the early 50s, the advances in performance were dramatic. In 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the high-visibility orange straight-wing Bell X-1, and only 6 years later, the Air Force was taking delivery of the F-100 Super Sabre, a swept-wing, shiny metal hot rod with a top speed of Mach 1.4. A major concern of both the Air Force and the Navy in the 50s was the fear of Soviet bombers flying en masse with nuclear payloads to the United States. To counter this, a number of aircraft were developed as interceptors in anticipation of the Soviet bomber horde. The F-102 Delta Dagger, the F-106 Delta Dart, and the F-104 Starfighter for the Air Force, to name a few. The Navy came out with the F-4D Skyray and the F-6D Missileer, among others. In retrospect, these were merely stopgap solutions, and it would be in 1953 that McDonnell Aircraft would begin work to replace its problematic F-3H Demon, and perhaps unwisely dubbed the design the Super Demon. Name aside, the Navy felt the need for the Super Demon had already been fulfilled by the upcoming F-8U Crusader and the F-11 Tiger, and asked McDonnell Aircraft to rework their proposal as an all-weather fighter bomber. In 1954, with a letter of intent in hand, the McDonnell team began work. A mere 6 months later, the Navy again changed its perspectives and asked for a two-crew, all-weather Fleet Defense interceptor. Weapon system development is a risky and time-consuming business. A request for proposal, RFP, for say an aircraft is issued that will need to meet a host of parameters. Fly faster, fly higher, invisible to radar, with the ability to fly around the world on half a tank of gas, and be movie ready for the next Tom Cruise Top Gun epic. An exaggeration? Not exactly. A new weapon system, whether it's an airplane, a tank, or ship, will be expected to do more than the system it is to replace, and often to do things no one knows how to do the day the RFP is issued. A larger issue for a new system is that it's usually in response to a present threat, a present danger. The Phantom, despite exceeding most of the requirements it was expected to meet through its 7-year gestation period, would suffer one glaring omission because of the perceived threat of Soviet bombers, an internally mounted cannon. With the Cold War driving most defense objectives and budget requirements, both military and civilian leaders had taken a very narrow view of how, what, and where the next war would be waged. One aspect of that thinking was that American military forces, both land and sea, would be threatened by over-the-horizon threats, Soviet bombers, and more critically, that the up-close and personal dogfight was a thing of the past. This new all-weather interceptor being developed by McDonnell Aircraft would be missile-laden, medium-range Sparrows and short-range Sidewinders for its air superiority role, but no gun. This bit of macro thinking wasn't prepared for the very bloody micro-conflict that was Vietnam. The Vietnamese had no bomber fleet, and the ROEs during Operation Rolling Thunder required visual contact with any Vietnamese aircraft before engagement, so there would be very few successful uses of the Sparrow missile. The Air Force would remedy this error of omission by mounting a gun pod on the F-4D and then having an internal 20mm cannon on the F-4E. The Navy F-4B my father had mastered in VF-121 at Miramar would have no such mod, and off he and his fellow squadron mates of VF-151 went to Vietnam to wage war in this imperfect but ultimately effective beast. For my brother, sister, and I, it was a thrill to watch the hulking gray mass of the Coral Sea as it moved away from the dock at NAS Alameda across the bay from San Francisco. We were surrounded by hundreds of other family members, all dressed up to send off their loved ones. As it was July, the officers and enlisted men were in their whites as they stood shoulder to shoulder at the flight deck's edge as the boat slowly made way with the help of tugboats into the channel. My mother was armed with her Kodak Instamatic, but those pictures are lost to memory. This would be a beautiful picture if it were true. We weren't even in San Francisco. I have no memory of my dad leaving, no big hugs, no tears at the door, my mother taking one last kiss with her foot slowly leaving the floor and then swooning to the couch as the door closed behind my dad. None of it. He was just gone. We were comfortably at home in Poway, a 20-minute drive from Miramar. My brother and I were probably looking for horny toads, rattlesnakes, and lizards as we roamed the rocky scrub that surrounded our modest, rented rancher on Tierra Bonita Road overlooking Poway, while the Coral Sea made her way under the Golden Gate Bridge as she nosed her way towards the Pacific Ocean. We were safe and sound in our mother and grandmother's bosom, while my dad was alone with his thoughts. My dad would use two forms of communication to let all know how he was doing and what he was thinking. For my mom, brother, sister, and I, it was an early cassette tape recorder that my dad paid $30 for. The only memory I have of listening to them was my mom having the machine in her lap with her finger firmly on the stop button, ready for my dad's signal that the rest of the tape was for my mom's ears and not ours. Sadly, those tapes are long gone. For his mom and dad, it would be letters, and I have them, or at least some of them. The great American novel is not buried in the depths of these missives, although he did say he wanted to use the tape recorder at his end of the family communications to take down his thoughts and later write about his experiences, to perhaps write the great American novel. The novel never happened, but he did in fact write several articles for the magazine Flight Journal about some specific incidences during his time over Vietnam, but we'll get to that in a later installment. The letters do, however, open a small window into his feelings as the boat approached Vietnam. He says in one letter that he's getting tired of the never-ending lectures about what to expect, the typical sexual disease films to the more frightening and concerning escape and evade lectures should he be shot down. He sums it up with these thoughts on August 15, 1967. I'm getting anxious to get on with it and get this cruise over with. Don't think the combat can be as bad as the mental image formed, getting so you feel as if you're going to run into flak as soon as you get off the catapult, which is far from the truth. Not exactly. Task Force 77, that was home ported out of Naval Air Station QB Point in the Philippines and commanded the Navy strike operations over Vietnam operating from Yankee Station in the Tonkin Gulf, would only be 90 miles off the coast of Vietnam. So once the strike force formed up for the day's operation, there were only minutes from Vietnam and the anti-aircraft weapons that came with it. A month later, in September, he writes, "The flying itself has been good so far. We go Barrier Combat Air Patrol, BARCAP. They're stationed up near the islands. Target Combat Air Patrols, TARCAP, that keep MIGs away in the target area and strikes where we drop bombs. Nobody has seen a MIG yet. I've been on about 5 strike hops so far and only saw flak on one of them as I was rolling in my dive. Fortunately, the vision in front of us were flak suppressors and bombs landed after they only got off a few rounds. No more flak. We'll probably see more as this thing progresses. Looks like it does in the movies, except you have the startling realization that the bastards are shooting at you." This initial introduction to combat flying over Vietnam was tame compared to what was to come. The targets would become more difficult and better defended. SAMs would become a more persistent and ominous threat on better defended, higher value targets, and more terror-inducing than the movie flak. We will end here with a bit from a letter from November 4th, 1967. After being on the line for a couple of months, he says, "The last day on the line period, 27 October, went 3 miles south of Hanoi. Didn't care for that a bit. A number of SAMs and medium flak. Don't think they expected us to hit where we did. Spent 17 minutes over land. Seemed like it took 1 minute to get in and 16 to get back over water. Spent most of the time at 500 to 600 knots doing violent maneuvers. Didn't look in the cockpit once." Things had gotten sporty. So, until next time when we continue with my dad's big adventure and take a closer look at some of the flying he did over Vietnam, thanks for joining me for the 11th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the journey. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.